Although he didn't say it aloud, that was the message he wanted to convey. He imagined Eruki standing on top of a high wall, confidently looking down like an arrogant king. He could easily defeat someone like him. He stood silently, thinking about it. After a moment, from the tall, luxurious building on the other side, a voice rang out. This time, Eruki will definitely win. It turned out that the group of three was sitting and talking. The friend sitting at the table with his legs crossed tilted his head and continued, scoring over 600 points. Shirone is pretty good, huh? The person sitting on the left, leaning on his hand, responded, it's just that Eruki is too strong. Another voice chimed in, I don't think Shirone knows his own limits yet. On Eruki's side, he sat with his hand propped against his cheek, arrogantly looking elsewhere, completely uninterested in what the two people standing in front of him were saying. One of them spoke up, Eruki, would you like to join our research group? Teach us how you do it. How many points do you think you can score? Shirone sat here, leaning on his hand, looking at Eruki with a dissatisfied expression. That's right. Unlike someone who had given his all like him, Eruki still hadn't unleashed his full potential. Then he quietly thought to himself, if he didn't realize this soon, all his strategies would be in vain. Suddenly, Nade placed his hand on Shirone's shoulder, smiling with squinted eyes and said, it's okay. We're cheering for you. Then he continued, actually, both of you are my friends, so it doesn't matter who wins. Shirone turned around irritably to look at Nade, responding, seriously, when I was eating, I couldn't even tell if I was chewing food or my own fate. Nade leaned both elbows on the table, tilted his head slightly, and spoke leisurely. I really feel sorry for you, but as a spectator, this is actually interesting. We're all excited to see who between you two will break the score record. Shirone was curious. The score record? Is that real? Then he asked, how many points is it? Whose record from a graduated senior are we talking about? Nade smirked and replied, hey, don't tell me you don't know about your girlfriend's score. Upon hearing this, Shirone turned his head and asked, what? Nade said loudly, it's senior Amy's, 987 points. At the same time, elsewhere, possibly in the schoolyard in front of a two-story building, many people were walking by. A girl with pink-red hair was sitting leaning back in a chair when she heard someone call her, Amy. It turned out that Siriel had just run over and called out to her. Siriel, worried, stood in front of Amy and said, long time no see. You've gotten so much thinner. I guess the graduation class is really tough, huh? Amy handed Siriel the documents while smiling faintly, revealing dark circles under her eyes, and said, if you stay up late, you'll end up like me. Here are the documents you asked for. The two of them sat down on the chairs, drank water, and chatted. Siriel asked, is the promotion test really difficult? Amy took a sip of her drink and replied, it's not that hard, but the standards are very high. Even if you score high, you might not pass. Then Amy made a serious face, as if they were going to study everything she had done so far. Siriel gasped, oh my gosh, that's so intense. But immediately after, she lowered her head and smiled awkwardly, reassuring her, don't worry, even though it's called the graduation class, it's actually more like a level 4 advanced class. With your skills, you'll be fine. Siriel cupped her drink with both hands, looking at Amy with admiration in her eyes. Wow, I think she's changed a lot. Amy's mindset had definitely become much steadier. As she was thinking, Amy suddenly spoke up. How's Shirone doing these days? Siriel was stunned by this, and suddenly she screamed in shock. Oh my gosh, have you two never met? Are you really dating? She continued, her voice echoing by the artificial waterfall. There's something really interesting going on lately. Amy seemed uninterested and asked, so? Siriel looked at Amy, worried, and continued. When you were in 5th grade, he once challenged you. His personality is really strange, always pretending not to care about others. But after beating me, he used that emotion to provoke me. Hearing this, Siriel nervously asked, so is he some kind of genius hunter or something? And what about our Shirone? Aren't you going to help him, Amy? Siriel asked anxiously, one question after another. Amy simply rested her head on the armrest, holding her drink with the other hand, and calmly replied, why would I need to? He doesn't need my help. And who exactly is our Shirone? She suddenly screamed, you're so heartless. Why are you being so cold to your boyfriend? Amy frowned slightly, sipped through her straw, and softly replied, no, that's not what I meant. Siriel smiled confidently and continued, Shirone knows what he needs to do. On the other side, Shirone was gasping for breath, his face drenched in sweat. It turned out that he had just completed the rapid-fire test. Everyone was in awe when they saw the scoreboard on the wall display. Time's up, level 30, 700 points, 0 minutes remaining. Shirone was now breathless, leaning on his hands, his knees buckling as he loosened his collar, clearly having given his all. The two people standing under the podium earlier took turns exclaiming in astonishment, I can't believe someone in 5th grade scored 700 points. That bastard is ruthless. He's a freaking monster. Everyone was now talking excitedly, saying that to achieve that score, one would have to level up 10 times in 10 seconds, and they couldn't believe Shirone had managed to do it. He frowned and staggered as he walked, nearly exhausted. Eruki, with his hands in his pockets, arrogantly approached him and said, "Congratulations, 700 points is a high score, not bad, huh?" Shirone breathed heavily, glanced at him, and replied, "Because I wanted to prove something to you." Eruki closed his eyes, walked past him, and smirked. "I know." Siriel's voice rang out. "So, did Shirone win?" Amy took a sip of her drink, looked up at the sky, and sighed, "What does winning or losing matter? It's just a test." Siriel, surprised, looked at Amy and asked, "What? Are you bragging about your undefeated reputation?" Then she yelled, "I know you defeated Eruki, the one who holds the record for the highest score of 987 in the rapid-fire test." Amy scoffed and retorted, "No, I never competed directly with him. I just told you about his taunting tricks." Then she glanced elsewhere and said seriously, "If we really took the test, I'd probably lose." Siriel froze. "Huh?" Her scream echoed everywhere. "What?" Back at the scoreboard, the black board displayed the word over. 711 points, no time remaining. The crowd in the stands cheered. "Stop!" "That's Eruki's result." He's looking at his score. Someone shouted loudly, "Just 1 point apart. I can't believe he scored 700 points and is still so calm. What is Eruki's limit?" Everyone was curious. Siriel stood still in the crowd, thinking to herself, "I'm sure now." She looked up at Eruki with a reluctant expression, silently thinking, "I can't beat him." Siriel's bag was carelessly placed on the table. He sat silently on the simple bed in the large room, the sunlight gently shining through the window onto his face. He looked outside, lost in thought. After the break ends, the exams will begin. Only 3 days left. He closed his eyes, lowered his head, and sighed. "I can't find any other way to defeat Eruki in such a short time. Should I just give up? It's just a test." Suddenly the phrase, "only the weak say that," appeared in his mind. He fell silent, furrowing his brow in thought. The image of Eruki with a cold expression surfaced as he said, "If you don't have the skills, then fine. Just idealize life and pretend you're the best." His expression changed abruptly, filled with unwillingness. He recalled a series of painful memories, the injustices he had recently endured. He thought to himself, "No one will believe what I say." The last image that appeared was of him as a child, witnessing the bodies scattered in the alley. He struck a match and lit the candle. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, he looked at the candle burning on the table, deep in thought. Have I lost my sense of reality from studying at the aristocratic school for so long? Actually, Eruki's words aren't wrong. Then he thought further. The world won't listen to those without power. Shirone's eyes suddenly glowed with a blue light as he silently told himself, "I won't give up." He sat up straight, closed his eyes, and focused, determined to surpass Eruki because there was no other way but to overcome the numbers. Small drops of water gradually formed larger numbers, greater than 1. A question flickered in his mind. What are numbers? In his subconscious, Shirone floated among the numbers, silently asking, what is the sequence of numbers? He gathered the numbers together into a spherical field of light, shining brilliantly in his palm. He raised it to eye level, asking himself, what is its core? Then he told himself, don't overthink this. He raised his hand straight toward the sky and let it fall, continuing to think, if I keep getting lost in these thoughts, I won't be able to observe the whole picture. As he thought, he relaxed his hand, and the small blue light slowly fell. As he sensed it, the lights gradually formed smaller beams, each falling down one after another. More and more solitary lights surrounded Shirone's body, making him feel as though he were floating in midair, transparent and glowing with a brilliant blue light. His eyes widened as he focused on each light, wondering how many he could count. He thought to himself, I can. Shirone flew up into the sky, chasing the source of the light, then thought, how far should I go? He approached a shimmering barrier like rippling water, in the center of which was a deep, swirling vortex. As he flew into it, he wondered in confusion, what is this? The end of numbers? No, numbers are infinite. Shirone touched the rippling surface with both hands, still confused, thinking, then what is this? Suddenly, the space around him began to crack, and he gasped in astonishment, his mouth almost hanging open. The ground beneath him started to crack as well, and he looked down, only able to exclaim in surprise, huh? The crack beneath his feet grew larger, eventually creating a deep hole. He stood there, bewildered, unsure of what to do next. Back in reality, he hastily opened his eyes, gasping for breath as he thought, I must have reached it, but what was that? Or was it just an illusion? The candle on the table was almost burned out, only the hardened wax remained. He stared at it, wondering, could it be death? Was it really just an illusion? I felt a very strong pull. Shirone sat cross-legged on the bed, placing his hands together, then suddenly looked out the window, unable to explain those numbers. Perhaps they weren't just there for counting. He looked up at the bright moonlit frame above the tower, thinking to himself. Shirone said, "Then I realized 40 hours had passed since I closed my eyes." The next day, at the building where the rapid-fire test would take place in the first comprehensive training field, the day of the 5th grade speed shooting test, on the field, 2 people were standing in the middle, and the stands were already packed with people. The scoreboard on the wall lit up, and someone sighed, saying, "I'm so worried, so worried." It was those 2 male students again. The person on the left asked, "Why are the lower class students here?" The person on the right frowned and answered, "Probably just to watch." I used to do the same. Suddenly everyone turned to look at the door. "Oh, over there he is." Then someone exclaimed in surprise. "Why are the seniors from the 4th class here?" And Siriel is in that group. The male student groaned, holding his head. This is too much pressure. The person on the right awkwardly spoke to reassure him. "Don't worry. They're probably just here to watch the match between Shirone and Eruki." The people sitting behind fell silent, not daring to speak, as Siriel and her group took someone else's seat. She smiled with squinted eyes, raised her hand, and said to the student who lost his seat, "Thanks." The male student, who had been crying earlier, replied, "Oh." Of course. He looked up at the schedule for the day, seeing there were many events. A voice echoed, "Today's main event." The blackboard lit up. "Eruki and Shirone will face off in the Group 20 match." The pink-haired male friend asked, "I wonder who will win." The person sitting in the middle stroked his chin and replied, "Eruki is leading." Siriel raised her index finger, confidently saying, "It's still too early to say that." Then she looked at them, mischievously smiling as she continued, "Since it's a group test, the scores can change." If it were the real environment, she confidently said Shirone would win. At this point, a minute had passed, and the first round of the test ended with the person on the left winning, scoring 427 points. He happily raised 2 fingers and said, "I won. The other person is not happy. Even though I passed the test, I still feel frustrated." Siriel sat in the stands, frowning with her chin in her hand, thinking, "They say that, but what should I do? I'm so worried." A minute later, Nade's group's test ended. He stood wiping his sweat, quietly rejoicing, "I did really well." Itella stood behind the desk, shouting loudly, "Great job, Group 19. She turned the paper over while smiling with squinted eyes and continued, "Now, it's time for the final group, Group 20. Immediately after, cheers filled the room. Eruki and Shirone both stepped into position, and everyone cheered their names. "Shirone, Eruki!" The cheering echoed, and Eruki and Itella felt nervous. He stood silently amidst the applause. Nade casually spoke up, while Shirone seemed overly focused. The 2 friends raised their fingers to their lips, signaling him to be quiet. The cheers gradually subsided, and the 2 stood in the center of the arena. Itella's voice rang out, "You have 1 minute." She stood behind the 2 and spoke gently, "Many students are watching you, so I hope you both do your best." Shirone focused on listening and gave a slight nod, while Eruki showed no interest at all. Itella shouted, "Then let's begin." The information board on the wall had 2 buttons, yellow for Eruki and red for Shirone. The yellow button beeped first, and the entire audience fell silent, focusing intently on the arena. Shirone began counting numbers in his head, his eyes shining with brilliant light, like in a dream. Then, the red button for him beeped, and both of them activated their fields for battle. They each used their unique techniques. Eruki's was powerful and winding. Shirone's was decisive and firm. The audience in the stands was mesmerized, exclaiming in awe, "Incredible!" Both of them were at level 12 just 5 to 8 seconds in. Someone cheered, "From the start, all the targets have exploded." Shirone's eyes emitted blue light as he poured all his field into his palms. The crowd cheered in admiration. Both of them are so good. As Eruki launched his technique, he glanced at Shirone, and someone remarked that his field seemed smaller now. Indeed, Eruki's moves became sharper and quicker, shattering each target. The person sitting next to Siriel crossed their arms and said, "So this is the power everyone talks about in Eruki's rumors. It's really strong." She spoke seriously, adding, "That's why Amy calls him a formidable opponent for Shirone." Then she blinked in surprise. "Huh? Shirone's score is higher?" She looked up at the scoreboard and exclaimed, "Shirone's score is 121, while Eruki's is 119. She shouted angrily. "That bastard Eruki is messing around again, huh? He thinks he can turn the tide and dares to play around. So cruel." Meanwhile, Eruki kept smiling inwardly. Everyone is misunderstanding. He swung his hand grinning, and as he launched his technique, he thought to himself, "I've been giving my all from the start." Eruki glanced at Shirone, silently thinking, what has this guy done in just 3 days? He observed Shirone, who was focused on his moves, and thought that on the podium, Itella watched them intently, thinking to herself, I understand now. The first time you walk down a path, it feels long, but when you go again, you'll reach the destination faster. Counting numbers is the same, but you've come so far. Shirone, Eruki looked at him, a strange smile on his face, like a person who wasn't quite normal, and said, this guy is really crazy. Shirone quickly swung his hand forward, concentrating his field into his palm, shooting at the targets one by one, causing them to explode. Then he stared at his palm, silently thinking, release the module. Itella, standing outside, was deeply surprised and began to think, he's gathering the numbers together while simultaneously calculating. This strategy can only be used by someone who has reached the limit of their cognitive calculations. She remembered the moment Shirone stepped into the arena, and to achieve this, he must have reached a state of extreme focus beforehand. But if that was the case, at that moment, he was intensely focused on attacking as quickly and accurately as possible, reminding himself just a slight distraction in the matrix, and all the efforts he had put in so far would be for nothing. He had to stay focused at all costs. He furrowed his brow, thinking this. In his mind, a bolt of yellow lightning struck toward the source of light in the distance. On the information board on the wall, the scores of the two increased. Shirone was leading with 469 points, while Eruki had 432. The gray-haired person sitting at the same table as Siriel suddenly exclaimed, the point gap is widening. She and the girl next to her leaned on the table and stood up, shouting loudly, Shirone, go! Everyone in the stand stood up, cheering loudly. The girl with blonde hair and twin braids turned toward the arena, shouting, go faster! The atmosphere in the arena was intense at that moment, with both of their techniques being powerful and swift, which delighted the audience and earned them admiration. As Eruki launched his technique to explode the targets, he thought to himself, this can also be considered a form of encouragement. The guy dared to break his usual methodical approach, meaning he had bet everything on this move. He glanced at Shirone, smirking, and said, all right, I admit it, Shirone, your spirit is as strong as mine. Immediately, he clenched his fist and thought, but my gamble will always be on a completely different level. Eruki emphasized this thought, focusing his field into his palm. His eyes cold as sparkling blue lightning appeared around him. Suddenly, everyone was stunned, some stood up, and others squinted to get a better look. There was something strange. Eruki's score! Someone exclaimed in astonishment, his score just skyrocketed. Eruki's score suddenly shot up continuously, with his level surpassing Shirone by 1 rank. The two people standing beside him were also stunned, with the person on the left speaking up, but I think Shirone is not falling behind at all. The person on the right responded. The rhythm of Eruki's explosions has suddenly changed in a strange way. Unbelievable. Shirone's group of 3 stood up, and the pink-haired girl asked, did anyone notice something unusual about the after image of Eruki's field? She furrowed her brow and replied, I've noticed. That's not just a normal after image. Shirone, in a panic, pointed forward and shouted, he has 2 fields at the same time. Suddenly, 2 fields appeared around Eruki, enveloping him. Everyone was extremely surprised, and someone shouted, so that's possible too? Itella, astonished, began to think, dual fields. That's a sign of a separated mental shift technique. I never imagined I'd witness a student using this technique. On top of that, they're executing 2 consecutive sequences simultaneously and even recording the entire process. Itella blinked, thinking, even if they had the scholar syndrome, this ability is still extremely rare. I can't believe a child would hide such a powerful skill. She thought to herself, another unexpected variable has appeared at this magic academy. Siriel and her friend were both intently watching the arena, murmuring, Amy was right. Eruki's dual fields pierced through the targets, flying across the air beneath the ceiling. Siriel's voice rang out. Eruki really is a monster. Eruki raised his hand straight ahead, manipulating the dual fields to destroy the targets. The scores of the two suddenly stopped. Eruki had 845, while Shirone had 692. Someone exclaimed, it's over. Nade's group of 3 stood intently observing, and the person on the left said, so it seems like everyone has already guessed the result. He continued speaking. Shirone, at this moment, stood silently, a heavy atmosphere surrounding him. He thought helplessly, in the end, I still couldn't win, even after betting everything I have. In his dream, Shirone floated in front of a mirror where he could see that he had tried his best and now felt exhausted. He told himself, but I'm still not even half of Eruki. Sadly, he thought to himself, even though I tried my hardest. His hand relaxed, then he clenched it into a fist again. Shirone thought, the best I could do? Sweat beaded on his forehead as he lowered his head, eyes closed, whispering to himself, "Not yet, I'm still afraid." He was afraid whether he was allowed to walk down that path. He then swung his hand into the air and punched the mirror in front of him with all his strength. But now, it didn't matter anymore, Shirone thought. A hole appeared in the mirror's surface as he withdrew his fist. Next, Shirone gathered momentum, raised his fist high, gritted his teeth, and stared determinedly at the hole. He would overcome it with his own hands. A strong force struck the mirror, causing it to shatter into a large hole that blazed with brilliant light. Shirone stood frozen, watching this. The bright white light reflected on his face, shining throughout the space in his subconscious like daylight. Back in the arena, Atella suddenly turned her head to look at him, glancing with a puzzled expression. Shirone. She couldn't believe it as Shirone's golden beams of light pierced the targets, each shot passing through the center with a diameter measured in mere millimeters. Truly, the light was so small, it was almost unbelievable. The audience in the stands was once again struck with shock, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Someone shouted, "Hey, look at Shirone. The light is getting brighter and brighter." Siriel's group was equally frantic, as if they were about to rush down to the arena. Shirone stood silent, his head lowered. The light emanating from him was so intense that the green targets began to turn black. Then, they were completely shattered by the beam of light from Shirone, not a single fragment remaining, even though he didn't need to do anything else. The scores of both increased rapidly, but it was clear that Shirone's score was rising faster than Eruki's. Eruki turned his head to look at Shirone, coughed, and then gritted his teeth, thinking to himself, "No matter how fast you are, I'll definitely calculate faster. There are only 5 seconds left. I will calculate every number in this world." Eruki's dual fields continued to accelerate, with only 4 seconds remaining. When Eruki's dual fields hit the target, there were only 3 seconds left. He thought to himself, "I have the upper hand now. I can win." Just 2 seconds left, then only 1 second. Eruki frowned, gritting his teeth, thinking, "Damn it, why is time moving so slowly?" The crowd stood up in unison, cheering as the match ended. Eruki suddenly sat down on the floor, deep in thought. It's over. He looked at the scoreboard, satisfied, and thought, well, the score's not bad. So I won, right? His score was 1,247. He then turned to look at Shirone, silently wondering, how's Shirone doing? He was confused when he saw that Shirone wasn't reacting at all. Suddenly, someone ran over, shaking Shirone's shoulder and shouting, "Shirone!" That's when Shirone snapped out of it, breathing heavily. It was Siriel, and she slowly let go of his shoulder, asking worriedly, "Shirone, are you all right?" The people around them gathered around the two. Shirone spoke up, "Sister Siriel, the test is." She turned her head to look at the scoreboard on the wall and happily said, "You won." Shirone was stunned as he looked at the scoreboard. She continued, "You even set a new record." His score was 1,253. The students around him cheered, saying in unison, "Congratulations, Shirone." He stood there, dazed, thinking to himself, did I really win? Suddenly, Eruki walked over, calling him. Shirone looked at him in astonishment, as did everyone else. Eruki continued, "Wide area magic is prohibited in rapid fire tests, you know?" Shirone remained silent, lost in thought. "That's right, isn't it?" The entire arena was covered in light back then. Eruki's voice rang out, "Ha, you're really bland." He put one hand in his pocket, extending the other to offer Shirone a handshake. He smiled and said, "Just because there's photon emission doesn't mean it's photon magic. I was just kidding." "Congratulations on the win." The male students around them all exclaimed in unison, "Wow, Eruki actually admits to being defeated. Is the sun rising in the west?" Shirone took his hand, stood up, and said, "So now you're ready to admit what I said? That life is more important than research?" Eruki responded seriously, "Yes, you're right." Shirone seemed unable to believe his ears and asked again, "Huh? You're really saying that?" Eruki replied calmly, "But it seems like you misunderstood. An explosion doesn't mean violence." The others were confused, not understanding what the two were talking about. Eruki explained, "An explosion is just a large amount of energy being accumulated. To call it violence, you'd need an intention to harm others." Nade and Sariel stood next to each other, wide-eyed in confusion. Nade whispered, "That's something Shirone doesn't care about." Shirone frowned and retorted, "That kind of energy is controlled by humans, so it's still dangerous," Eruki said. "Well, the person must be responsible for controlling that immense amount of energy. By the way, I have something I want to ask of you." He looked at him, full of curiosity. Eruki said seriously, "From now on, you'll be responsible for me." His voice rang out, "An explosion is just a large block of energy, an energy that cannot be controlled. But if we can control it, it could be the source of energy that saves 100,000 lives, Eruki said seriously. A strange light from the pitch black sky shone down on the city. Eruki stood facing Shirone and said, "A new era has begun. We no longer just fight against nature." Of course, he didn't hold such noble ideals. Shirone stood silent for a moment, then responded, "Why didn't you say that from the beginning? If I'd known, I wouldn't have misunderstood." The people around them began talking. Eruki replied, "I wanted you to know where you belong, as the one who holds the power." Hearing that, Shirone looked surprised. Eruki continued, standing upright and serious, "Or are you the one who only knows fear?" Shirone focused on him, thinking, "I understand now." Eruki is afraid that his power will spiral out of control. He looked at Eruki thinking this. With a pained expression, Eruki said, "If you defeat me, you'll prove your will. So, the only one who can stop me is you." He looked at Shirone and honestly said, "If you can't handle me, I won't take another step." Those standing behind Shirone heard this, confused, and murmured in question. Damn, he's saying he won't move because he's afraid of his own power? Shirone was confused and didn't know what to do, suddenly hearing this and still not understanding anything. He looked at Eruki with concern, unsure if he was delusional or being realistic, but one thing he was sure of, the fear in Eruki's eyes was real. He stepped forward, took Eruki's hand, and said, "I promise, when the time comes, I will stop you." Everyone in the arena was bewildered, not understanding what was happening, and they all exclaimed, "Huh?" Meanwhile, Nade, with tears welling up in his eyes, rushed over to the two of them, calling out, "You guys?" He wrapped both arms around their necks, pulling them close, laughing and saying, "This is so awesome. I'm proud to have you as friends." Attila, standing behind the crowd, spoke up, "Shirone, come here for a moment." He turned his head to respond to her. "Yes, ma'am." Eruki, however, was being squeezed by Nade so tightly that he could hardly breathe. Shirone followed Attila out. Suddenly, she grabbed his shoulder, her voice sharp, making him startled. "Shirone, do you know what you just did? Do you really want to leave here?" He froze at her words. Shirone stammered, "Professor Attila." She furrowed her brow and said, "Where you're about to go. If you go there, you won't be the same anymore." Shirone lowered his gaze, feeling dejected, and replied, "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was this dangerous." Attila spoke softly, then lowered her head in thought, giving him a serious warning. "The domain you're about to enter goes beyond numbers. It's called the infinite realm, and sorcerers often refer to it as the immortal function." She looked straight into his eyes and continued, "And our monks call it Nirvana." Shirone was shaken upon hearing that term, knowing that humans could reach the infinite, but anyone who touched that point would no longer be themselves. He thought to himself, beyond the numbers, what he saw there, the mirror that he had shattered, was an immense space. Remembering earlier, Shirone felt like he was being pulled forward by a powerful force, and then thought to himself, it kept pulling him deeper and deeper. In his sleep, Shirone suddenly jolted awake, gasping for air, his hand pressing against his forehead. He got out of bed and leaned on the table deep in thought. It was that nightmare again. Ever since entering that place, he had been having that nightmare every night. He recalled the strange feeling inside him. He held a glass of water, but his hand was shaky, causing the glass to spill onto the table. Suddenly, his whole body trembled, and he braced himself against the table to keep his balance, clutching the fabric of his shirt in front of his chest with his other hand. Fear crept in, that horrifying sensation occasionally resurfacing. He had asked Professor Attila about it, but neither of them could figure out why his body was reacting this way. He looked down at the puddle of water spilled on the table, full of worry. What the hell is happening to me? One afternoon, as the birds flew back to their nests, Shirone's voice echoed throughout the room. "Lately, I think I'm being haunted." He sat in a chair, his face showing clear signs of exhaustion from not having slept well for a long time. Eruki and Nade, sitting next to him, turned to look at him with curiosity. The three of them were in some room, with Nade sitting on the left side on a long chair, scratching his head and smiling awkwardly. "You're so serious that now I'm really worried." Shirone, sitting in the middle, responded wearily, "I am serious. You know, this is a research group on spiritual science." Eruki crossed his arms and smirked. "The level of concern from someone who's beaten me is really something else." Nade, surprised, asked, "But why do you believe he's telling the truth?" Shirone gave a bitter smile, pointing his index finger at Eruki, asking, "Did I ask something stupid?" "I guess that's not it." Eruki propped his chin on his hand, looking at him, and said, "The dream you mentioned, you said you saw yourself in an empty, dark space, right?" He continued, "And the stars were being pulled towards somewhere." Shirone nodded. "Yeah, one of them." Eruki's voice rang out, "And in the end, that barrier shattered, and a beam of light shot out, right? Shirone widened his eyes and replied, "Oh, yeah, that's right. The movement was like a heartbeat." Eruki crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Considering both the size and the speed of the space you're talking about, it's a number that no one on this continent could ever predict." Now, Eruki had earned a new nickname, Eruki the Spiritualist, responsible for giving critiques. In a joking tone, Eruki said, "If we consider that place to be real," then with a serious face, he continued, "it definitely has to be beyond the universe." Nade and Shirone both jumped, looking at Eruki, and simultaneously exclaimed, "Beyond the universe?" Shirone looked at Eruki with suspicion, asking, "Are you talking about the universe in books? But how could I dream about it if I've never seen it?" Nade propped his chin up, his sharp gaze focused, and raised his hand, speaking seriously. "I've heard about this." Shirone, flustered, called out, "Nade." He too had a new nickname, White Nade, the Spiritualist Group, responsible for asking questions. He explained earnestly, 200 years ago, a condemned prisoner underwent a soul-swapping experiment. The hypothesis is that if a person's soul is materialized, electricity could potentially separate it. A closed circuit, or in other words, the person would be placed in an iron box and have electricity run through them. However, due to the inhumane nature of the experiment, Nade had been stopped long ago. The condemned man survived, and his consciousness returned after a month. But Nade paused for a moment, then continued. He learned about the situation in countries outside the continent, places he had never been or even heard of. Shirone, bewildered, asked, "Is that true?" Nade propped his elbows on his thighs, furrowing his brow as he replied, "The information the condemned man provided has been verified, and everything has been confirmed as true." He glanced at Shirone, probing, "The soul was separated by electricity. The people were ionized, causing electrons to form. Is it possible that this power drew information about the world to the condemned man?" That was a hypothesis. The strange tingling sensation the condemned man experienced was a form of spiritual sensation. Hearing this, Shirone got goosebumps, wrapping his arms tightly around himself in fear, exclaiming, "Oh my God, tingling! Is that like the symptoms I have?" Eruki suddenly stood up, startling Shirone, and then said loudly, "That's why Shirone can see the universe out there. If your soul was ionized by electricity, leading to quantum phenomena, then the possibility of transcending space and time becomes real." Shirone, confused, asked, "Transcending space and time?" Eruki held his thumb and index finger close together, creating a tiny gap like a pea, and said, "In a microscopic world, smaller than even an electron, an event beyond human understanding can occur." He explained, "It's a world defined by probability, where you cannot observe and measure it simultaneously." Eruki imagined an electron orbiting in his mind, then continued, "If the soul is lighter than an electron, the connection between space and time becomes meaningless." He then pointed his index finger at the ceiling, looking at Shirone, and concluded, "It's entirely possible to perceive the space beyond." Nade, excited, pointed at Shirone. "What do you think? I guess I nailed your situation." Shirone shouted in awe, saying loudly, "So you figured it out? That's amazing. In a duo like you two, and yet this is a real research group," Shirone complimented. Nade smiled brightly and replied, "It's nothing. Seems like it's true, though." Eruki also smirked, crossing his arms and looking at him, saying, "It's just solving things. If we want real research, we need more information." Then he asked, "Why haven't you told the truth yet?" Shirone, confused, didn't understand what Eruki meant. Eruki coldly looked at Shirone. "During the speed test, your self-illumination technique had an issue. You also mentioned that you've been having nightmares every night since then." "Tell us what's going on," Eruki said, genuinely wanting to know. Shirone awkwardly looked down at the table. Shirone explained, "Actually, Professor Attila told me a few things." After hearing that, Nade exclaimed in surprise, "What's the immortal function? Eruki, do you know about it?" Eruki stood still without answering, just letting out a soft laugh. Shirone looked at him with slight panic. Then Eruki tilted his head back and laughed out loud. "I know now. So it's the immortal function," Eruki continued. "I've heard my father talk about it. It's the dreamland of mathematicians. There is a function there that becomes the key to everything in this world." Nade and Shirone both felt uneasy upon hearing this. Shirone awkwardly said, "But the professor also said it's very dangerous." Eruki spread his arms wide and said loudly, "Of course, because having everything is like having nothing." Then Eruki covered his mouth and chuckled, saying, "I know now. To defeat me, you need the immortal function." Shirone, both surprised and happy, looked at Eruki. He thought to himself, "I don't know why, but when I hear them joking around, I feel relieved." He said seriously, "I've made up my mind. I'll join the spiritual science research group." Eruki and Nade both jumped up excitedly upon hearing his decision. Nade asked, "Really?" Shirone replied, "Yeah, I don't want to be scared anymore. I want to study it myself and face it head on." He stood up, squinting his eyes and smiling, saying, "If I do it with you guys, I'm sure I'll find something." Nade raised his arms to the sky and shouted, "Awesome! Immortal function or whatever. We'll definitely overcome it. Now we have enough people, and we're officially a research group." He was so happy he almost cried. "That means we get the funding now." Eruki chimed in, "But do you think the professor will let Shirone join? Our group doesn't have the best reputation." Nade, with a mischievous grin, held up a piece of paper and said, "Trust me, I'll get you in without the professor knowing." Shirone and Eruki stared at him in confusion and asked in unison, "Is that really okay?" Nade lunged forward, took the paper from both of them, and with a wink said loudly, "Don't worry, it's all good. Let's go for coffee and celebrate the new member." He continued, "Today's on me." Eruki coldly reminded him, "But you're broke." Shirone didn't say anything, just glanced around thinking to himself. Then he thought, "This is my research group." He looked around the research room and quietly told himself, "Let's start with cleaning on some afternoon." But contrary to Nade's expectations, his group formation application was picked up by someone, and that person had a very angry expression. The most intimidating professor had discovered it. It was Sienna. She looked at the application with a cold, sharp gaze, her voice stern and serious. A voice rang out. It was Professor Thad. "Ah, another research group application." It's always like this around the holidays. He was holding a pile of papers up to his nose, glancing behind him as he replied. He was walking and talking, so he didn't notice the application fall to the ground. People gathered around for a while, and after some training, the group was disbanded. "Well, let's just get this over with." Sienna had already seen the application and spoke up to remind him. "You dropped this, Professor." He jolted, exclaiming, "Oh no." She picked the application up, read aloud, "This is..." Thad also peered over, frowning and saying, "Huh? Professor, this research group." He hesitated. "What is this research group?" They both looked at the application, and the group name read Supernatural Soul Science Research Group. In surprise, he said, "Supernatural Soul Science Research Group?" Then his gaze fell on the name Ariane Shirone. He glanced at the application and asked her, "Isn't that Shirone?" Sienna's face darkened, and she remained silent, not answering. She clenched the application so tightly it crinkled, then forced a terrifying smile. In the low mountains, deep within, there was a house. A voice echoed from outside. "I'm sorry, Professor Atella. I know you're in the middle of training." She sat cross-legged at the tea table, lifting her cup of tea, smiling with narrowed eyes and saying, "You've come all the way here. It must be something important." Professor Sienna was surprised. "So this is Atella's house." The atmosphere was quiet for a moment as the two sat across from each other, sipping their tea, the scenery serene. Sienna put her cup down and said, "Actually, Shirone has joined a research group." Atella happily asked, "Finally, he joined a group? Which one?" Sienna nodded seriously and replied, "The Supernatural Soul Science Research Group." Atella paused, her tea almost spilling out of her cup. Sienna continued with a slight tremor in her voice. "As you know, even before we became professors, this group already had a history of causing trouble. I receive so many complaints from the parents every day," she said, growing more anxious. "Why that group? Shirone is the future of the school. He should be focusing on his studies right now." Atella was taken aback, gently lifting her teacup with a soft smile, then spoke up, "But that group is different now, isn't it?" She raised her index finger, trying to defend Nade's group. "The current president is Nade, a good student who gets along well with his peers. There's definitely no problem with him. The troublemakers have all graduated, and the current president of the Tormia Magic Association was also once the president of that group." She added cheerfully, "I'm sure they'll share something good and learn from each other." Meanwhile, in Nade's group, he was lying comfortably with his head resting on the couch. Nade greeted Shirone. "Oh, Shirone, you're here?" Shirone, standing at the door, frowned as he wiped the dust floating up with his sleeve, feeling uncomfortable. "You guys." From the ceiling above, dust swirled around the room. Shirone waved his hand, sending the dust elsewhere, and continued, "Aren't you going to school? I'm feeling a bit unwell today." Nade, still lying back, cross-legged on the couch, responded, "I'm not feeling great today either." Eruki sat at the table, focused on a chess game, and said, "I'm always out of it." Then Eruki excitedly focused on his chess game. "All right, checkmate, one more round." His hands quickly moved two pieces at the same time, while Shirone stood behind, just watching without saying anything. He glanced at the mess on the right, silently thinking, "I cleaned this up, and now it's messy again." He spoke up, "You guys don't study, don't research, and still skip classes." Nade, confused, replied, "Huh? You can regret it, but just don't leave, okay? Shirone turned away, sighing as he took off his outer uniform jacket. I'm studying. He then walked over to the round table next to the long desk, pulled out his materials, and sat quietly to study. Eruki and Nade sat in silence, watching him. Nade, sitting on the chair with a bored expression, thought to himself, what a model student. Suddenly, Eruki propped his elbow on the table, leaned down, and smirked at Nade, saying, Nade, have you finished your new invention? Nade turned his head, glancing at him. Oh, right, of course. Eruki's voice rang out, reaching Shirone's ears. So, is this the invisibility cloak? While Shirone was taking notes, he overheard the two chatting enthusiastically. Wow, that's so cool. Really amazing, right? Shirone couldn't focus on studying anymore. Nade sneakily lifted his hand, trying to eavesdrop on their conversation. It lasts for an hour, and if we feed it energy like this, wow, that's amazing. Hearing this, Shirone could no longer pretend to be silent. He stood up abruptly, looked at the two of them with curiosity, and yelled, I want to see it too. Back at the meeting between Sienna and Atella in Atella's private home, Sienna calmly held her teacup, took a sip, and said, we were talking about Nade, and by the way, about the others as well. That kid Eruki in the 5th grade, pretending to be clueless. In her mind, two faces, Eruki's and Shirone's, came to the forefront, and she pondered, have you seen his ability? And Shirone, who defeated that monster, Eruki. When these graduation class students leave, perhaps these two will become the shining stars of the academy. Suddenly, she anxiously set her cup down on her lap, speaking with a tense tone. What if Shirone starts hanging out with kids like Eruki and becomes as rebellious as he is? He could become the academy's biggest failure. Atella, hearing this, looked confused and concerned, speaking up, failure? Then she eased up, saying, oh, you're worrying too much. Shirone stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with surprise as he observed something remarkable in the research room. The usual hum of conversation fell silent, and every gaze in the room turned toward him. His focus was unwavering, clearly captivated by the sight before him, a moment filled with emotion and curiosity. As he continued to examine the scene, the environment seemed to shift around him. His expression was one of awe, a mix of wonder and intrigue. The air was thick with anticipation as Shirone's mind raced with questions. What was this discovery? What could it mean for their research? The room seemed to hold its breath, and Shirone's voice broke the silence, filled with a sense of awe. This could change everything, he murmured, his curiosity deepening. The discovery in front of him felt like a pivotal moment, the breakthrough their project had been waiting for. The weight of the moment settled over him, and his team gathered around, just as eager to uncover the potential of what had been found. Shirone reached out and picked up the red book. Eruki and Nade glanced at it. Eruki gasped and said, huh? Before Nade could say anything, Eruki quickly interrupted. Huh? Is this from the Human Anatomy Research Group? How did it end up here? Shirone flipped the book open, still looking at Eruki, and said, the Human Anatomy Research Group. As he looked at the page he had opened, his eyes widened in shock. The page featured images of two beautiful women. What's this? Shirone awkwardly dropped the book, his hands covering his face, leaving only his left eye peeking out. Aren't those students from our school? Eruki stared at the page, his brow furrowing slightly as he said, so it's from here. Nade calmly looked at Shirone and explained, this is like an informational booklet from some shady research group. The drawings are a bit crude, but it's filled with insider information. Eruki spoke in a tired tone. It's just to entertain those who are sulking. But he felt something was off and frowned in discomfort. Chung isn't intervening? Suddenly, his eyes widened and his cheeks flushed red. So that's why you reacted like that, because you saw Amy's picture in the book. Seeing Shirone fall silent, Eruki asked, why isn't Shirone saying anything? You're really dating her. Before Eruki could finish his sentence, Shirone raised both hands to the sky, awkwardly saying, You guys shouldn't be looking at this stuff. What the heck? Nade saw Shirone like this, raised his hand as if to say something, but just ended up calling out in surprise. Shirone quickly lowered his hands, looking at Eruki with concern, and tried to change the subject. Who's running this group? Eruki calmly replied, it's an underground shady group, but since most of it's about the graduation class, it's probably a member of the graduation class running it. He muttered anxiously, graduation class? And there's a group like this? Beneath the eaves of Atella's house, the faint sunlight gently reflected on her roof. Sienna's voice echoed, yes, that's right. The Supernatural Soul Science Research Group is also a shady group. She spoke seriously, continuing, the Dark Sorcerer Group is just child's play. The issue is, It's a game created by the smartest, most talented students in the school. They all have different talents: painting, superhuman eyesight. Sienna paused before continuing, very high level. They have communication and research skills. They can completely avoid the school's investigative system. She sat up straight, her hands clasped together, and explained solemnly to Attila. The reason we haven't touched the Supernatural Soul Science Research Group is because it's no longer an official group. The bright students are trying to resurrect this group. Then, with a cold, sharp gaze, she added, "So, I'm going to take this opportunity to disband it." Attila remained silent for a moment, then closed her eyes, lifting the teapot to pour tea into a cup. She spoke calmly. "I understand your concern for the students." As she poured the tea, she continued, "However, there is a reason the school doesn't interfere with those groups. To help students develop independence, the research groups are considered independent, and they must take responsibility for their choices." High on a tree branch, a bird's nest with a different color from the mother's pink feathers stood out. The mother bird perched beside it, tending to her chicks. Attila continued, "If we, as adults, take away that right from them, they will be afraid of making their own choices." She calmly looked at Sienna and asked, "Why don't we give them a chance?" Sienna fell silent, closed her eyes in thought, then furrowed her brow and said, "Of course, what you're saying is right, but," she opened her eyes, looking at Attila with concern, and countered, "I believe it's also our responsibility as adults to nurture the students' talents and prevent them from going down the wrong path." Attila fell silent, looking at her thinking, "I can feel Professor Sienna's love for Shirone. I want to give Shirone the time to make his own decisions, but I can't dismiss her concerns." With that thought, she spoke up. "I apologize for not bringing this up sooner, but this matter involves Shirone. In the recent speed shooting test, Shirone reached Nirvana. Upon hearing this, Sienna's eyes widened in disbelief, unable to accept it as the truth. Then she screamed, "What?" Her scream echoed through the mountains, startling the birds perched in the tall trees, sending them flying into the sky. In the research room of the three of them, the ceiling lights suddenly shook violently, and the ground trembled continuously. Shirone dropped to his knees, fearfully exclaiming, "Huh? Is it an earthquake?" Nade grabbed a cloak and stuffed it into a wooden chest, hurriedly saying, "This is bad. Hide everything quickly." Eruki also helped Nade gather up papers and stuff them into the chest. Only Shirone remained confused, asking, "Why? What's going on?" Eruki, while adjusting the couch, replied, "There's a professor controlling the storage room." Nade quickly adjusted the table, while Shirone stood watching, anxiously asking, "So what do we do now?" Eruki hurriedly said. "Just sit and wait." A hand was placed on the identification machine at the door, and a voice announced an urgent investigation. Sienna stood waiting for the door to open, her face serious as she thought. It would only take 3 minutes to head to the storage room, enough time to hide the evidence. Inside the research room, Shirone was forced to sit in a chair by Nade and Eruki. He panicked and shouted, "Aren't we going to greet the professor when she arrives?" Nade held Shirone's arm firmly, replying, "It's fine, just act like nothing's happening." Eruki, looking worried, added, "If we get caught, it's not just a suspension." Shirone nodded, following their advice. Nade sat cross-legged in the chair, intertwining his fingers, and said, "This research room is our territory. If you're scared, it's over." Shirone, still a bit doubtful, replied, All right. The door opened, and Sienna entered with her cold, powerful beauty, her presence dominating the room. Before her stood the three of them, seated in different postures, and the room appeared completely unremarkable. Eruki sat with his arms crossed, his face full of arrogance as he glanced at her. Nade sat up straight, resting both hands on the table, slightly bowing his head as he glanced up at her. Shirone sat upright, staring straight ahead, his expression serious. Sienna furrowed her brow, glaring at the three of them, thinking to herself, "I need to disband this group before it's too late." Her thoughts suddenly wavered, wondering why she had expected this reaction. But Nade, nonchalantly crossing his legs, spoke up. "We apologize. We were in the middle of a discussion." Sienna, displeased with his attitude, clearly showed her irritation. Nade remained seated with his legs crossed, resting his elbow on the armrest, fingers interlaced, grinning with his eyes squinted, saying, "If you'd sent an official notice before coming, we would have welcomed you properly." Sienna stopped looking at Nade, irritatedly glancing to the side, silently thinking, "What infuriates me the most is that Shirone is getting swept up in this too." Outside, Shirone seemed fine, sitting silently, looking down at the table, but inside, he was pulling at his hair, silently screaming, "Professor Sienna, is it okay for me to just sit here like this?" Then Sienna smiled and spoke up. "I don't know what the issue is, but when we have a guest." "Didn't you guys offer tea and drinks?" Sienna asked. Nade grinned, squinting his eyes, and replied, "Oh, really? You trust us enough to drink tea that we serve?" Shirone sat between the two of them, frozen, wishing he could disappear from the spot. She pushed her glasses up with her index and middle fingers, closed her eyes, and smiled lightly. "Then I'll quickly get to the point before I leave." She sat up straight, her tone serious. "I expect you to return to research group's room." As soon as she finished speaking, Eruki looked at her seriously. Nade smiled with his eyes squinted, and Shirone looked at her, slightly bewildered. The three of them leaned in together, wide-eyed, and said in unison, "What?" Nade suddenly slammed his hand down on the table, stood up abruptly, and shouted in pain, "Return the room? Why is it suddenly like this?" Sienna flipped through some documents, looking for something, then said, "I've thoroughly reviewed the files, and it's hard to find a reason not to shut down this research group." "The truth is, you haven't done anything for the past 4 years," Sienna continued. Shirone broke into a cold sweat, looking at Eruki, who was just as worried. She went on, "The truth is, you've lacked students for the entire semester, and that's reason enough to shut down this group. Your funding has also been cut, right?" Sienna flipped through the documents, reading aloud, "According to policy, if you create some value within a month, the group can continue operating. If not," suddenly Nade collapsed onto the table, clasping his hands in a pleading gesture, which left Shirone stunned. "Please, anything, just don't shut down the group. The supernatural research topics are ones that can't be proven, right? Do you really want to shut down the only group that could disrupt the magical society, which is too reliant on science and logic?" "We'll do anything except for the research results, please," Nade said desperately. Sienna held the stack of documents, resting it against her face as she looked at Nade and said, "If that's what you want, I have another proposition." Nade responded seriously, raising his voice. "Yes, I'll do everything." Sienna stared directly at Nade and said, "Kick Shirone out of the group." As soon as she finished speaking, Nade looked up, surprised, while Shirone and Eruki were equally shocked. All three were taken aback by her condition. They simultaneously shouted, "Why?" After a pause for discussion, Sienna spoke again. "Have you all made up your minds?" Nade and Eruki sat up straight in their chairs, unsure about what choice to make. Shirone, however, was forced to sit in the chair across from them. Shirone was equally confused. Sienna stood behind the chair, her arms crossed as she said, "The immortality function is a major issue that the students have not been able to solve. It's extremely dangerous for a young student like you. Shirone could end up disappearing because of it." He looked up at her, both anxious and frustrated, responding, "I know it's dangerous. I won't do it again." She turned to him seriously and said, "That's not everything. The real issue is overloading the capacity." He looked at Nade and Eruki, asking, "Overloading the capacity. What does that mean?" Nade seemed too scared to answer. Eruki explained to him, "Should I describe it like a disease that geniuses suffer from? I had it from 5 to 8 years old, but it wasn't too severe." He recounted what his father had told him. His father had said, "If you're already crazy, just shut up and live with it." Nade, curious, asked, "I don't know anything about this." Sienna placed her hand on her forehead, her voice sorrowful as she said, "I call it an issue because you all treat it like one. Overloading the capacity is a phenomenon where the mind can't control the sudden surge of information awakening. The brain accumulates something inside and starts emitting light outward." She explained, "It's like a dam unable to hold back an overwhelming flood. This is a severe symptom that can break your consciousness. But it's a mistake to think of it as something geniuses suffer from. There's a mother with a seriously ill child in bed, but because she heard it was a genius's illness, she felt both happy and worried and then didn't seek treatment." Sienna continued, "Many children miss the golden time to treat it and live a lifetime in suffering because of that. Thinking about overloading the capacity as the cause of immortality? Your teachers could never imagine how dangerous it could be." Shirone, hearing this, said, "So if I keep worrying and my consciousness collapses, maybe that's really how it is." The nightmare he dreamed of every night made his body feel constantly uncomfortable, like a series of cylindrical threads tightening within him. He thought to himself, "Maybe I've gone crazy." Sienna furrowed her brow, trying to convince him, "I think it would be best for Shirone to focus on psychological treatment, at least minimizing the impact on his studies." He lowered his head sadly, and she continued, "I will adjust myself to ensure no lasting effects. If you really care, please have Shirone come in." Suddenly, Nade shouted, cutting her off, "No!" Sienna glanced at him in surprise. Nade spoke with a tone that was resolute but also slightly humorous. "As the president, I don't think you know everything." Sienna, now angry, snapped, "What? Is this the time to get upset?" But Eruki spoke up, "Isn't this something Shirone should decide for himself?" Shirone stood frozen, taken aback by those words. Then he spoke up, I know you're worried, but isn't this going too far? Nade beside him muttered angrily, yeah, I have to say it straight. The reason you're doing this, Professor, is because you like what? He hesitated, then suddenly shouted in anger. You like Shirone, don't you? Sienna was taken aback and immediately replied, yes, what's the problem? Nade, as if struck by lightning, clutched his head and threw his head back, shouting, of course that's a problem. Who would think a professor would be attracted to a student? His face turned bright red, steam practically coming out of his ears. His eyes glazed over like he was drunk. If that's the case, does that mean you like me? Sienna coldly responded, no, not at all. Nade collapsed face first onto the table, groaning in utter disappointment. Abruptly, Shirone stood beside, urgently shouting, the president's done for. Hearing that, she spoke up, I don't want to get caught up in this right or wrong argument. Stop being stubborn and accept the reality. Eruki stood there looking at her before asking, Professor, if Shirone can't handle the overload, does that mean he can only go that far? He won't die, right? Shirone froze upon hearing that question. Sienna responded seriously, I think you already know this because you've experienced it yourself. This isn't a normal matter. It's the immortality function. Eruki furrowed his brow, confused, and asked, the immortality function is an area that's never been fully understood. That's where Shirone has entered. Should we trust him and wait for him? She worried that he might surpass his limits and then spoke up, Professor. He then seriously emphasized, and that's what everyone calls obsession. Sienna fell silent upon hearing this, looking down and gently biting her lip. She began to think, obsession? She recalled her childhood memories, hearing someone call her name, Sienna. You have to leave here. She remembered sitting alone in the middle of the forest, frightened, holding her head. Suddenly, Shirone spoke up, still confused. As I thought, it's something you have to decide for yourself. Sienna was startled, worried, and quickly turned to look at him. Shirone, are you serious? I'm also very scared. Like you said, Professor, there was a time when I thought I had gone crazy. She spoke in a panic. But Shirone interrupted her. No, I actually felt amazing. Sienna looked at him in shock. What? He placed his left hand on his chest, where his heart beat, speaking in a warm tone. It's not something everyone can experience, but it happened to me. I'm really afraid that the nightmares will disappear. If the nightmares disappear, I won't be able to uncover the deep secrets within myself anymore. He looked up at her, his gaze full of confidence. If this is a question just for me, I want to find the answer. I don't want to run away. I will face it. Sienna fell silent, thinking, just like him. She remembered a golden-haired boy who once raised his hand to help her, the one who had said, don't run away, look straight ahead. And she thought to herself, he's just like that person. After a moment, Sienna nodded. I understand. I respect Shirone's decision, and I will never think about him giving up again. The three of them were both astonished and relieved. Nade popped his head up from under the table and asked, So she agrees now? She turned her head, waving her hand with a bright smile. We'll return to the original terms. You'll show the results next month, right? Nade stared blankly, then suddenly stopped laughing, his face turning pale and ashen. The three of them sat on the bench by the waterfall, each looking in a different direction, while Nade seemed like his soul had left his body. Shirone, confused, spoke up. What should we do now? We have to show the research results in a month, right? Do you have any notes on previous research? Nade, as if drained of life, couldn't answer. Eruki furrowed his brows in thought, then replied, as far as I know, the group hasn't done anything. If there was anything, the science of supernatural souls is already in the textbooks. There's no evidence proving that souls exist. Eruki said this with a sense of helplessness. Finally, Nade spoke, his voice strange, his face still pale. I'm sorry, former president. The research group will end with this generation. He said more, but it was inaudible. Shirone, teary-eyed, still tried to encourage him. Nade, hang in there. Suddenly, Eruki, who had been slouched in his chair, sat up straight, his eyes bright with excitement. Beautiful girl. Shirone quickly responded, now's not the time for that. Focus. But Nade remained as lifeless as before. But when he heard beautiful girl, Nade jumped up, covering his eyes with his hand to block the view, continuously asking, where? Everyone was looking at a girl in a long dress with purple hair, walking in the distance. Nade stared at her without blinking, then exclaimed, who is that? Is there anyone like her in the advanced class? Eruki touched his chin, speculating, there's no one like her in the advanced class. Did she graduate? Shirone looked at the two of them in confusion. Eruki asked, do you remember every girl's face in the advanced class? Suddenly, Shirone realized that the girl looked very much like Sienna. He blushed and let out a gasp. Shirone and Nade shouted in unison. It's Professor Sienna, Nade exclaimed loudly. What? No way? Can someone change that much? Eruki looked at Shirone and asked, Shirone, you have a good eye for girls, huh? Pervert, Shirone hurriedly explained. No, that's not it. Then he wondered, but where's she going this weekend? And she's wearing makeup. They continue to watch Sienna's retreating figure, exchanging opinions. Eruki guessed, is she going on a date? She's at that age after all. Nade didn't believe it. What? She has a boyfriend? Suddenly Nade jumped up, muttering, this is our chance. Shirone, sitting beside him, wondered what Nade was planning to do. Nade, excited, said, after we pursue Professor Sienna and find her weakness, we'll use that to stop the research group from being disbanded. Eruki spoke seriously. Following a level 6 sorcerer with certification isn't easy, but we have the invisibility cloak. With that, the two of them ran off, leaving instructions for Shirone. Eruki said, I'll trail the professor first. You go with Nade. Nade pointed at Shirone, shouting, I'm going to grab the cloak from the research room. You know how to keep your distance from the target, right? This is the only way to save the research group, they said quickly before running off, leaving Shirone standing there, confused, not understanding anything. Then Shirone screamed in frustration, use your brains and study. At that moment, Sienna had stopped, looking around with a cautious and wary attitude. The three of them, Shirone and the others, were hidden under the invisibility cloak behind an apple stand. Eruki spoke up. She's very cautious. We almost got caught. Nade, grinning mischievously, replied, looks like something's going on. Who is she meeting? Shirone, dissatisfied, muttered, why do we have to do this? Then he continued, slightly worried, but something doesn't feel right. As the four of them wandered through the busy marketplace, Shirone asked, aren't they supposed to avoid the commoner areas? Sienna walked, glancing back frequently, seemingly on alert. She even turned around carefully when she noticed something suspicious. Then she quickly moved past the market stalls. Eruki stated his opinion. There's definitely something shady going on. She's too cautious. Nade, concerned for the safety of the documents, muttered anxiously. Shirone shot him a disapproving look, saying, do you think she's like you? Sienna stood before a house in a residential area, smiling as the door opened. A man stepped forward, extending his arms to embrace her, expressing his joy. The three of them exclaimed in unison, it's a man. Nade, excited by the new information, thought, her secret commoner boyfriend? This is juicy. Could this be a forbidden love affair banned by her family? Eruki and Shirone stared at Nade, watching as she entered the house, while they remained outside. Still, Nade couldn't hide his curiosity and quickly dashed off, running down the street with excitement. What are we saying? We need to follow the professor and gather evidence. For the survival of the research group. Eruki and Shirone were helpless against Nade's decision. Nade gestured to Eruki. Eruki, it's time. Eruki cleared his throat, preparing himself. A burst of green light appeared in the iron locks within the door. Ah, the lock opened under the pressure. Nade exclaimed joyfully. I knew the basement lock would be the loosest. Let's go. Nade and Eruki quickly explored the house's floors. The first floor revealed nothing. Awesome, let's break into the second floor. Use your shifting field to check the hallway first, Nade said enthusiastically. Shirone could only stand there, smiling weakly, feeling helpless in the face of his friend's carefree attitude. Why don't these two use their incredible intellect and drive for something productive, like studying, he thought. The three of them, using the invisibility cloak, moved along the wall, listening carefully around the house. Suddenly, Nade signaled for them to stop. Wait, I hear a woman's voice from that room. The door ahead was closed and the sound coming from it was clear. Shirone, sensing things were about to go too far, cried out, let's go back. Nade stopped him, saying, Professor Sienna initiated this. We have no other choice. Nade pressed his ear to the door to listen. Sienna's voice came from inside. Aren't you going to change? Amin replied gently from within. I like this outfit more today. Sienna asked again. Should I change? Amin decided for her. No, just keep this one on. You look great. Eruki and Shirone, standing outside, blushed in embarrassment, murmuring, I think we should stop listening to this. Inside, Sienna asked. When are you going back to your wife? Amin replied, probably in about 2 hours. The three outside were stunned. The professor is dating someone who's already married? Inside, Amin quickly wrapped things up. All right, great. Let's get to work. Eruki chuckled and said, well, this is even better than finding a weakness. Nade was stunned by the words he had just heard. I don't think that's a good idea. He quickly grabbed the doorknob, determined to stop this wrongdoing. We have to stop this from happening. The three of them rushed into the room, tears streaming down their faces, trying to stop something that shouldn't be happening. They cried in unison, Professor, don't do this. This is wrong. They were all shocked by the sight before them. The door was trembling, unable to withstand the pressure. Amin was sitting there, painting, which left the three of them utterly confused. Painting, they thought? Sienna, trembling, said, "You children." The sudden appearance of the students made her angry, and she shouted, "What are you doing here?" Immediately, all three of them were punished, their hands raised, trembling, unsure of when they had been lifted into the air. Nade, leading the charge, spoke up to apologize. "I'm sorry, we thought," he continued. "We thought you were doing something." Adult. Sienna was taken aback by the excuse. "What? You really think I would do something like that?" she angrily commanded. "Go back to the school, and you'll see what happens." Eruki sighed in helplessness. There has to be punishment. Eruki dragged Nade out in front of the imaginary gun. He's the one who started it. Shirone, standing beside, quickly presented the evidence. The invisibility cloak is also Nade's, you know. Nade stood in the middle, unable to react to the betrayal from his two friends. "You traitors, why didn't you oppose any of this?" Amin quickly stepped in to resolve the situation. "Don't scold them anymore. He's fine, and the door's already been fixed." Sienna still felt a bit guilty, but Amin spoke up to explain, "Your students followed you because they were worried about you, right, Sienna?" Amin smiled lightly and gestured that it was fine, even though being followed was due to her carelessness. Breaking into someone else's house was wrong, but surely the kids didn't think much when they rushed in because their teacher was here. He slowly moved toward the door, adding, "I'll go make tea. You all talk for a bit." The group quickly responded, "Thank you." The three of them looked at Amin with admiration, thinking, he really is an angel. Watching him move so slowly, Shirone suddenly wondered to himself, is he blind? Suddenly, Shirone felt a heaviness in his head. He clutched it, thinking, why does my head feel so heavy all of a sudden? Could this be related to the feeling of pity? Sienna, helpless, placed a hand on her forehead and said, "Thankfully, Amin is a generous person." Shirone immediately asked, "Professor, may I ask, who is he?" Nade beside him couldn't hide his curiosity. "Right, what's the relationship between you two and why do you have to be so cautious when meeting him?" Sienna, feeling a headache from her students, replied, "Amin is a senior who studied at the Magic Academy with me when I was younger." Eruki asked, "So he's a sorcerer too? But why did he lose his sight?" Sienna suddenly sighed, hesitating before speaking. "Amin, she lost her sight because of me." The atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of her words. Sienna remembered that day when she was running through the torrential rain. In her youth, she too had experienced the overload. The image of her crying loudly in the rain was accompanied by the narrative, on that disastrous day, the only thing she could do was run away. Amin, still just a boy back then, had shouted at her, "Sienna, it's dangerous. The water is rising." Sienna stubbornly ran away from Amin. "No, don't come near me." Soon after, she was swept away by the water. Sienna was carried by the current, hearing Amin's frantic voice shouting, "Sienna." He too leaped into the raging water. The two of them clung to a large log, with Sienna crying in fear. Amin tried to comfort her. "Hold on tight. If we try to hold on until we reach the lower stream, we'll be rescued." Amin saw ahead of them a massive pile of logs, stacked haphazardly in various sizes, dangerously blocking their way. He instructed Sienna, "Sienna, we need to dive under. Can you do it?" With tears streaming down her face, Sienna, filled with fear, stammered, "I can't. I can't." Amin, with little time left, immediately pressed Sienna's head down into the water, continuously reassuring her, "Hold your breath. I'll keep you submerged. You must not come up. If you hold on tight, we'll survive." Sienna obediently responded, "Yes." Amin was alone above, facing the massive logs blocking their way. He felt a surge of belief. Yes, we will survive. The deafening sound of the water crashing echoed around them as a log slammed into the pile of wood. His thoughts repeated, "At the very least, you must live." Tears fell from Amin's eyes as he waited, not knowing what would happen to them. Sienna bitterly recounted the story, speaking of the magical academy genius Amin. "He lost his eyes like that, gave up his dream of becoming a sorcerer, even though we both survived." Everyone fell silent, their eyes filled with sympathy as they listened. Sienna continued, "When I heard he became a painter, you can't imagine how shocked I was." Nade softly spoke, "So that's how it happened?" Eruki also understood. "Nade, she's very worried about the overload." At that moment, Amin entered, speaking and dissipating the heavy atmosphere. "Sienna is a nag, isn't she?" Sienna suddenly asked. Amin and Shirone quickly responded. "Thank you, uncle," Amin continued. "Even though Sienna nags, she really cares about you all. She's always talking about her students." Nade awkwardly scratched his head and said, "We also respect her very much." Eruki, sitting nearby, took a sip of tea, casually replying, "It's just iced tea." Shirone moved closer to the painting Amin was working on and asked, "If you don't mind, could we see you paint?" This took Amin by surprise. "See me paint?" Nade eagerly responded, "I'd love to see it too." Eruki asked curiously, "How do you paint when you can't see?" Sienna noticed her students were being a bit rude and spoke up. You kids, don't be so rude. Amin gently reassured Sienna, I'm fine, and there's not much time left. I need to continue painting. Sienna, you agree, right? Sienna immediately agreed. Of course, even though it's a little embarrassing.